Good afternoon, evening, and morning, everybody. I'd really like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar. We have very good coverage, particularly from Africa, and a good mix of UN and NGO colleagues. So thank you very much for joining. My name's Gareth Price-Jones. I'm delighted to be hosting this peer-to-peer webinar on the HCT and ICCG linkages. So the aim of this webinar is to give the floor to field practitioners. Our two speakers will highlight some key initiatives that have been supported by the humanitarian leadership in Pakistan and Ethiopia to strengthen the coordination between the strategic and the operational sides of operations, sharing their experiences, the challenges, and some of the lessons learned. But before introducing the speakers and the topic a little bit further, I'd like to say a few words about the webinar and how it works. First of all, you're with us for 60 minutes. During the first 30 minutes, I'll be asking questions to our two speakers, and they'll be providing their reflections on the topic. During the second half hour, I'll be taking questions from you, the audience, that I'll direct to the speakers. But before we get started, if I can just give you some technical guidance and some ground rules that we should abide through to make it a successful webinar. Firstly, could you ensure you stay on mute during the webinar? And if you can keep your camera turned off, that just keeps our bandwidth clear and helps those with less good connections. You can use the chat box on the right-hand side of your WebEx window to communicate with everyone on the webinar, so that can really open up the conversation. Do feel free to use that. It's one of the interactive features that I particularly like about webinars. If you have questions for the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen, just below the chat box. And please note that we'll be running two polls during the course of this webinar, and your response to that helps the peer-to-peer team ensure that these webinars are valuable and as effective as they can be for future webinars. If you have any issues connecting, please contact Venkatesh. You can see him there in the participant list. And he'll help you solve the problems. Alternatively, you can also watch the non-interactive feed that's on YouTube. And we'll also be recording this webinar, and an edited version will be uploaded onto YouTube. So you can find other useful webinar recordings on the site website. So moving on to the topic, in many humanitarian reviews and evaluations, weak collaboration between different components of the coordination architecture is often cited as contributing to a less effective humanitarian response. The operational peer reviews and P2P mission findings corroborate this statement, identifying oftentimes a disconnect occurring between the strategic leadership, the humanitarian country team, and the group that's responsible for operationalizing the humanitarian response, the intercluster coordination group. This can happen when the HCT doesn't provide sufficient strategic guidance to the ICCG, or to operationalize the response, or when the ICCG doesn't provide the HCT with sufficient information and analysis to take strategic decisions. So, and we hear this particularly from my background on the NGO side, we hear this a lot. So how do we overcome these challenges? How can HCTs and the ICCGs turn this relationship into a more productive collaboration, supporting the delivery of an effective humanitarian response? Our two senior and very experienced speakers, Neil Boona, HCRC in Pakistan, and Alexandra D'Souza, ICCG coordinator in Ethiopia, are going to share their views and experiences of a well-functioning relationship in their operations, as well as lessons learned from the challenges they've been confronted with. So Neil is the humanitarian coordinator and resident coordinator in Pakistan, and he's been there from September 2015. Prior to this position, he served in Geneva as the director of the UNDP Geneva office in 2014 and 2015, and from 2011 to 2013 as director of the Geneva office of UNDP's Bureau for Crisis Prevention and Recovery. Mr. Boona brings to his position 12 years of experience serving as resident coordinator and UNDP resident representative in Sri Lanka, Bulgaria, and Belarus. Prior to these appointments, Mr. Boona spent many years in the field with UNDP, including in Malaysia. 2 seconds. Am I still connected? Yes. Including in Malaysia, Pakistan, Bhutan, Sudan, and Sri Lanka. Alexandra D'Souza is OCHA's Deputy Head of Office in Ethiopia and the ICCG Coordinator. Before taking up this position, she assumed the roles of OCHA's Deputy Head of Office in Pakistan and Team Leader for Syria. She's also worked with UNMIR during the Ebola crisis in Guinea-Conakry, and with UNICEF in Iraq. She also worked with UNICEF and WHO in headquarters, as well as governments, NGOs, and academic institutions in Guinea-Bissau and Brazil. So firstly, I'd like to come to you, Neil. Your operation effectively adapts the response based on information that you get from the ICCG. Is there anything specific that you've instituted in Pakistan as the HC and with the support of your HCT colleagues to make the relationship with the ICCG work, keeping in mind that many operations face difficulties in developing a successful two-way communication between those two groups of people?
Yeah, Gareth, thank you. And I think the main element is, although we have geographic distance from our ICC, we're actually remarkably close. And that's even witnessed from today, because just about 15 minutes ago, I came back on the road from Peshawar, where I participated in a meeting that was the ICC with some members of the HCT, together with officers from the military and from the civilian authorities that we work with. So I do think it's unique to have this distance. I mean, what is special is also that we only have the clusters rolled out in this one particular part of the country, the area that used to be called the federally administered tribal areas, covering particularly the IDP response. Albeit we do have a less formal coordination mechanism that can kick into place in the event that there was a natural disaster, which in fact we may be dealing with in some issues with respect to the drought at the moment. But I think in effect it's a more efficient system, because the fact that we don't have a national layer to go through, that we're actually working with people who are directly managing the operation at the field level, makes it very real. And I think also makes the humanitarian country team respond to realer issues. The other thing is, and it's not something I take credit for, my predecessors had it already in place, but each HCT, members of the intercluster group, basically people from Peshawar, the heads of the offices there, they participate by video link in every HCT, and on every agenda item, we actually have them lead. Not in every agenda item, but on some agenda items. For example, the situation report, we get the people from Peshawar to present that. And again, that creates a more operational reality for the HCT and its strategic decisions than if it was simply myself or someone from OCHA reading that report. And then I think another thing is that we invite regularly people from the field missions and also from the ICC to participate in the HCT to directly report on the situation in the field. So if it's a protection issue, we might have invited the PROCAP person we had working before, quite often the OCHA head of office, but also technical staff, for example. When we did vulnerability surveys, we invited them in to present directly to us. And then what's also helpful is the physical presence of the OCHA Peshawar Intercluster Coordinator head of office. That head of office, who's currently a he, normally travels to the HCT and is present and complements the work that's the presentations that are done from Peshawar directly. So clusters form the backbone also of the Access Working Group, providing strategic direction to the intercluster mechanism and the HCT. The access is a big issue, but the fact that we have this nice link, as I saw today in practice, where we have a close, very operational, almost weekly or daily contact with the authorities on access issues from Peshawar, but we can reinforce that with sort of strategic oomph and more senior level staff coming from Islamabad, the headquarters, does seem to be improving access. Over to you, Gareth.
Excellent, thanks, Neil. I'm sure that balance between having the in-person presence and the regular technological link also helps build that level of trust that you need to have those structures working really effectively. As many of us know, Pakistan's now transitioning from humanitarian to recovery and development work, challenging some of those traditional humanitarian humanitarian architectures and pushing humanitarian development leadership to develop new structures. Can you tell us a little bit about how that transition is being handled in Pakistan and what consequences you see it having on the linkages between the HCT and the intercluster group?
Yeah, in some ways, it's a bit of a classic situation in a post-conflict where you've had millions of people displaced and the humanitarian community has assisted in their return. Some are still displaced, although it's an increasingly smaller number. And people are trying to rebuild, recover their lives and actually have the opportunity to develop. So we put together a transition framework which we did together with the government partners and with key donors, and of course using the cluster leads as the key partners in it. So they helped put together this transition framework working with the development partners. And in it, the clusters operate very much in harmony with the transition mechanisms. So we're creating transition mechanisms, creating what we call outcome groups for 4 of the key areas. But the clusters are working parallel to those groups and are part of those groups as well. And in some ways, it might sound structurally complicated, but it's actually not so difficult because many of the agencies, in fact, almost all of them that we're working with in this situation also have a development element to their work. So they're using the humanitarian architecture and the support and types of analysis to continue to provide the humanitarian assistance, but switching over quite smoothly to being part of this outcome working groups. Another thing that we found has been useful for this transition is to continue to use our pooled funding mechanism. We have a small fund, about $8 million, but we found it has been useful in 1, keeping a focus on humanitarian needs, and 2, actually building confidence with the partners in the government and military we need to work with in that area. And then 3rd, perhaps most importantly, it actually is delivering real results on the ground. But of course, complications exist with any transition. In this particular case, one of the complications is the government, partly in response to popular pressure, decided to accelerate the integration of these tribal areas with the neighboring province before putting in place a number of recommended transition mechanisms. So in some ways, our transition mechanism is one of the few there. And the other thing is, of course, agency interests always come into things. And there's issues of donors from different windows of funding. But at the same time, I think it was interesting today that the military themselves, in a presentation they gave to us, used the cluster base for analysis because they're comfortable with it. And I know that's unusual. Quite often, national authorities are skeptical about keeping clusters. And the agencies prefer to keep the clusters at the moment because it allows us to continue to access humanitarian funding sources and technical sources. And this has proved to be the right decision because although 3 years ago when I first visited these areas, I would have thought by now things would be getting back to normal. Sadly, because the conflict in Afghanistan continues and that has a spillover effect in Pakistan, there is still an element of instability in those areas, which is affecting the reconstruction and means that there still are humanitarian needs. So it's good we have the clusters, but it's also important we have these outcome groups that look at the recovery and the longer term picture. Over to you, Gareth.
Excellent, thank you. And Neil, you described to us the outcome groups. Are they explicitly linked to the kind of collective outcomes thinking that we're seeing with the Nexus, or is this something specific to Pakistan?
No, it's exactly linked to that. I mean, I think it was at fairly early stages of the Nexus that we put these together, but we decided to create 4 outcome groups, but explicitly linked clusters to them. And I mean, one deals with restoration of social services. One deals with essentially livelihoods and economy. One deals with governance. And the 4th deals more broadly with resilience and social support issues. So they match quite closely to the cluster support.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. So I'd like to take the opportunity now to come to Alexandra from the ICCG side of the table, and similar to the first question, Alexandra, but from the opposite angle, we know that the ICCG can only really be effective if the HCT is providing it with a clear strategic direction, which the clusters can then operationalize. This is a challenge in many operations, but in Ethiopia it seems that the two-way relationship is effective and that the HCT is providing that strategic guidance that's required. Are there any specific steps that the HCT or the ICCG took to establish that relationship and make sure that the HCT is engaging clearly?
Hi, Garrett. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Very good. Well, I'm delighted to be here because I used to be the deputy OCHA in Pakistan. So it's lovely to hear from Neil and hear the news of how my ex-country is doing. Very nice. Yeah, this is such a different context, and you know, from what Neil was describing, and I lived in Pakistan. You know, in here, the government is very, very much on the lead. We have to negotiate and discuss almost every step that we do with the government, but they really act more like a partner than a counterpart. Is a very interesting dynamic, very different. So, but to respond to your question, I mean, basically, the advantage of having the ICCG in the same city or the same location as the HCT, it's that they basically prepare the agenda for the HCT. I think that is the key of these you know, relation. So the ICCG meets every 2 weeks and the HCT every 2 weeks, and this alternates. So let's say one Wednesday, the ICCG prepares the agenda for the HCT of the next Thursday of the following week. So basically the operational partners led by the cluster leads in the ICCG decide or agree what are the issues for which they need strategic decisions to be taken the following week. The reason why I mentioned the government is because having the government within all these layers adds an additional complexity, but I think also, you know, gives some richness and some support to the overall humanitarian response. But of course, you know, when the ICCG meets, they have already they come with this information and this advice that they got into their relations on the everyday relations that they have with the sectors from the government. Yeah, I mean, the big difference with Pakistan is that we have a very strong donor participation in our HCT. And so you know, it helps in some ways to have the donor participation there, but it's also comes with a bit of a challenge. But overall, the advantage is that it brings accountability to all of us. They're very active, they're very, you know, they don't hesitate to voice their concerns and their questions, and so they're not part of the ICCG, but the ICCG is very much aware that, you know, the following week the questions will be a mix of NGOs, donors, and agencies' concerns. Yeah. So over to you, unless you have any specific questions.
Thank you. Just very quickly, and do you find, in terms of one of the global challenges with whether or not donors engage in HCTs is whether that maybe changes behavior and openness in those meetings? Do you have any challenges that you've had to face on that front, or has that all been fairly smooth?
Oh, yes, that's a very good question. We do have a lot of challenge. You know, Ethiopia has been for 50 years a country where the main issue was food security. And only in the last year and a half, I would say, the environment is changing into a more complex emergency. And so it's a completely different ball game. And the dynamics are very, very different when you move into complex emergencies. So, you know, having the donors there, as I said, you know, it's helpful in many ways, but when you're dealing with complex emergencies, it changes the dynamic. So we're seeing in the last year a lot more, you know, pre-HCT meetings with the heads of agencies that are cluster leads, then, you know, to discuss internally difficult positions that we have to take in terms of policy and operations and all that, where we often also bring in cluster coordinators, you know, that are specifically involved in some of these difficult decisions. And this is discussions that we can't really always have in a very large forum with a lot of donors, and where you know, there's a lot more political influence there than, you know, we wish to have.
Excellent. So that sounds like, so basically it's taking a flexible approach to make sure that you can still address those issues.
Yes, I mean, you know, for example, you know, just recently the government of Ethiopia had made a political decision to return some IDPs in a location that has been the focus of a lot of international attention. And of course, some donors were, you know, concerned on what does this means in terms of a principled humanitarian principle approach. Should we just, you know, leave the area, and since we disagree with the way that this process is taking place. And in our pre-HCT meeting, we discussed among the agencies that we wanted to have a needs-based approach. We thought that this was what makes more sense for the people. And the decision should be, you know, if needed, be to influence the government to take a more principled approach. Perhaps we should suggest that some development programs should be, you know, put on hold until we have this principled approach implemented, but not put people's lives at risk, and uphold humanitarian response. So this type of decision, you know, we need a forum where we need a different type of forum. With the donors, it becomes very difficult to have this discussion. But they're very useful to have in the HCT.
Excellent. No, that's really good to hear the different different perspectives and how you use those flexibly in Ethiopia. The next question is around the HCT and ICCG are in most operations based in the capital city, and Neil was sharing with us some ideas on how that can be addressed. But it often results in the front line of the operation being geographically distant from both the HCT and the ICCG. How does that geographical challenge affect the operation in Ethiopia, and how have you managed to overcome this challenge with the HCT?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Ethiopia, we can't really use the solutions that Neil has in Pakistan, which I really enjoy having, you know, the colleagues from Peshawar on the screen at the HCT. But here we have too many, you know, operations, too many sub-offices. We have too many conflicts going on in the whole country, and we already have a huge HCT that has too many participants. So it wouldn't be possible to function in the same way. So you know, what we do is at the ICCG, we need to have a very strong ICCG. The way the HCT is strategic is because the ICCG works well, and the ICCG brings a lot of information at those meetings from the subregions. The subregions have their own ICCG. We have two subregions where we have very well working ICCGs. The ones where they're the regions where they're weaker, of course, we get less information, and then they filter in more through our field coordination officers that bring the issues to the ICCG. But it's really about making sure that those regional bodies work and share the minutes. We always aware of when they're having ICCG meetings, what is the agenda. They provide us with concise minutes, and then we have our field officers that report in the ICCG what is going on in those regions, what are the issues, and how we need to have an operational focus here and there, why, and so on. So the ICCGs are so critical for us to discuss all these things that are going around the country in terms of operations, and really make very clear agendas that we need, with very clear objectives that we need to then take over the following week to the HCT for decisions. Thanks a lot to the very active participation of our field officers.
Thanks, Alex. And it sounds like that preparatory work is really, really critical to enabling the HCT to take those strategic decisions and not get bogged down. So that sounds really effective. Could you just share for us, HCTs can look very different in very different contexts. Can you share with us how big your HCT is? How many members do you have there?
It's huge. We try to cut it down a little bit, but right now we have maybe, I would say more than 20 people around the table, sometimes even more. We have, we had just recently a new humanitarian coordinator. He's interim here, and he was a bit shocked when he arrived in Ethiopia and saw how big our HCT is. Our meetings, the HCT meetings, normally are scheduled to take an hour and a half, and they never take less than 2 hours and a half. Mostly because every other month we have a new conflict erupting, and we have to address it. So now we took a strategic decision that we're going to have information meetings to put everybody aware of what is going on in the country, and we will have only 2 strategic decision points in the HCT agenda, so we can be very a lot more strategic and less information. I think this is something that we've been struggling, and in other countries where I've worked also, it's always the balance between information sharing and the strategic decisions. But when you have so many things happening all the time in the country, and everybody looks at the HCT as the place or the moment where they're going to get all the information they want, it's impossible to have it short and strategic. So we're going to have to separate those things. This is a decision that we making as we speak now in the last couple of weeks. We hope to implement this at the beginning of the year. So it's if you don't mind spending 2.5 hours sitting at the chair, is a very useful meeting where you get a lot out of it. But if you want it more strategic and you really only have an hour and a half, then which is the case of many people that attend the HCT, then we really need to have another information body on the side. And this is because many of the participants are not operational participants, so they don't attend ICCG, they're not in the field. It's many of these donor agencies that are very present there and very vocal, and their thirst of more information, and including on the operational side, that makes this dynamic a bit towards the information side and less the strategic. But we're going to address it.
Thanks, and I think there's a really good examples for all of us about how you have to adapt the ways of working to the context and the scale of the challenges that you're facing, particularly when you have multiple crises coming up. It's very easy, I think we all recognize it's very easy to get caught into those day-to-day information sharing, and using that time effectively to remain strategic. It sounds like you've really got that working very well there in Ethiopia. So thank you both very much for those responses. We're going to move now to questions from the floor. So thank you for those that have already been submitted. And if I can come to you first, Neil, our first question here is, what evidence indicates if the linkages between the HCT and the ICCG are strong or weak? What are the kind of key performance indicators for you that tell you it's working well?
Well, I think that probably the best performance indicator is the level of communication between the two of us. I mean, just the fact that today we in effect had a meeting of the ICCG, which a number of the members of the country team participated in, and that we were able to have an open dialogue with military who were involved in the parts of the operation and the local civilian government, to me shows that there's a level of communications. Now, I guess the question is there evidence-based as to whether it's actually improved the performance of the ICG and the country team? It's very hard to, I think, determine that, because we don't have the sort of counterintuitive of what would be the situation without it. But I do know from my experience in other operations that this sort of separation of the operations and strategic is often a barrier to the operational information being fed into the strategic, and at the same time the operational people not understanding the strategic considerations. And the fact that we've been able to do this operation in an extremely complex setting with elements of conflict going on, all sorts of access issues. The fact that our operation is trusted by partners and can operate where others can't, I think shows a degree of effectiveness that hasn't been present in all the other operations that I've worked in. Over.
Excellent, thanks, Neil. And Alexandra, one of the questions for you is, how do you ensure that you in the ICCG are receiving the questions from the HCT, and also how do you make sure that those decisions are getting down to the clusters and are translating into actions on the ground?
Thank you, Garrett. I mean, very easy. The cluster leads, the cluster coordinators, they attend the HCT as observers. So they, usually brief the heads of agencies, the cluster leads, and of course they're asked to intervene as we need on the discussion. So they are very much aware of what decisions are being made. They hear it over, on first row, and of course they also, we also share the minutes with all the participants, so they also have a written record, and then we usually take actions, and we follow up actions. So in every HCT we review the action points of the previous HCT. That's the first thing that the HC does. It goes through endorse the minutes of the previous HCT and then reviews the action points, and the ones that are not completed or ongoing, he asks the operational partners why.
Brilliant. And I would guess that then ensures that you get the two-way consideration of both the strategic and operational considerations that Neil was describing in the Pakistan situation.
Exactly. So, you know, if something was supposed to, you know, like we had a preparedness plan that was supposed to be completed and submitted, if he wasn't, then he asks why. And then, you know, maybe the situation on the ground changed and the head of agency informs of that cluster informs. And, you know, so there is a discussion, do we still need this plan or not anymore? And we go ahead with a different modality to deliver there. Etc. So I think you know, having the cluster leads attend as observers helps to get this two-way because they can be very helpful to, you know, advise their heads of agencies what you know, what is the situation, and they can intervene and being invited to, you know, describe what is happening, that you know, why that action point could not be implemented. So having that together with, you know, following up every 2 weeks on the action points that roll from 1 week, from 2 weeks ago to the next 2 weeks is very helpful.
So I'm hearing that regular follow-up is key as well in terms of making sure that you're converting the discussions into action on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do prepare our clusters a lot before HCT. We call everybody and say, this is an action point that is not completed, is going to come up in the next HCT. Do you think something can change between now and Thursday? And, you know, they update us. So everybody is well informed by the time we get to this meeting, but it's a moment to change the action point. You know, if the preparedness plan doesn't make sense anymore, then we make a different decision.
Absolutely, thank you.
Gareth, could I just jump in with one thing that I had overlooked saying, which I think maybe of some
Please do, yes.
I mean, one thing I found that has been helpful for me being involved in intercluster groups in other countries I've served as HC and when I've been on mission has been that often strategic issues come out of the operational discussion, and sometimes the HCT, especially if you have observers, ends up becoming a fairly formal type of meeting. And in a large country with a complicated operation, you may need that formality. But as a humanitarian coordinator, I want to also cut through that some of the time. And I found that myself occasionally participating in some of the intercluster groups has been very helpful to my understanding of issues and has helped actually with strategic decisions as well. Over.
Thanks. Yes, I absolutely recognise that. I think that's really critical to get that first-hand experience. It's great to hear you saying that in your very senior role, where I know there's often a huge number of demands on your time. So it's great to hear you making time to do that. Neil, can I come to you?
On investment, that's why.
Yes, absolutely. And can I ask you, Neil, we have a question here. Do NGOs have a special role to play as members of the HCT and the ICCG? So can you just talk a little bit to that one?
NGO membership in both the ICCG and the HCT, and they do have an important role to play. I mean, in the meeting today, for example, we had a representative of the National NGO Coalition, provided them to have some access to people they wouldn't otherwise have had access to. And I think, secondly, the nature of the information that you get in the HCT is different than what you may get from UN agencies, especially if you have national NGOs participating, because they have, you know, a different perspective. They're part of the country. If they're in a consortium, they often represent quite small organizations. And I just think it's very important to have this sort of honest feedback. I remember in one of the other places I work, where I work with you, Gareth, we once had a number of women coming in representing a particular NGO who were talking about how the resettlement program was actually accentuating violence against women. And it was quite a revelation, I think, and a disappointment for many of us, that this program that seemed to be well designed based on international best practice, because it didn't address the fact that there were so many women-headed households, actually was making women more vulnerable than less vulnerable. And we wouldn't have got that information if we hadn't had the links with the NGOs. Over.
Excellent, thank you. That's a really concrete example, very useful. So Alexandra, I have a question here about the way that you set the HCT agenda in Ethiopia. And the question is that agenda established only based on the ICCG input, or are there any strategic discussions ongoing anyway at the HCT, regardless of what the ICCG proposes?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Is it on or off? Okay, it's on. Yeah, excellent question. In fact, I mean, most of the agenda is really driven by the ICCG, but there is a large, the beginning of the HCT after we go through the action points that I mentioned earlier, then we do an overall review of the situation. And we usually invite when there's a security, of course, overview, and then we usually invite someone that has an understanding of, the political and social and sometimes even economic background of the conflicts that we're seeing. And I said at the beginning, this is a new context for many of the agencies that are working here, going from food security for so long, very clear, straightforward type of response to a more complex one. And so it's useful for us to have, and the country politically is changing so much, so we can't catch up unless we have some really experts coming and almost lecturing us in every HCT for a few minutes on why do we have a new conflict here, and what really started it, and what is the provisions, and how long is going to last. Is this going to have more displacement that we are already seeing, or not, and so on. So this is usually the second part, and then the HC also gives an overview of what he has done in terms of advocacy, because as like in Pakistan and Neil was describing, we also are having so many access issues and security issues recently. So he has been taking a much more high-level advocacy role, and there is so much expectations on the outcomes of these advocacies. And so usually that's and again, because we have also the donors there, is they put a lot of expectations on the HCT, and it's the occasion for us to ask our donors what they're also doing in terms of their, using their ambassadors for the same type of advocacy, and agree on key common messages and so on. So there is a good part of the HCT that is focused on those more strategic issues. And then usually the second part of the HCT is this operational that I mentioned.
Thanks, Alex. And in terms of getting that diverse input, what's the role of the government in providing that as well, as they sit on your HCT and lead it in such an active way?
Well, the government does not sit on our HCT. We have, we sit on their disaster risk management technical working group, which we held with them. We co-chair that group with them on a monthly basis. And so we sit with them, and the clusters sit with the line minister sectors, and we all have a common meeting. And usually tends to be quite operational. The government doesn't necessarily like to discuss strategic issues with us, at least not in a public and open forum, but they do it in a bilateral, and in a more cozy way. But publicly, it's quite limited to operational issues. There is a meeting, a group that we convey often with the government that we call strategic multi-agency coordination. We call it whenever we need it, and that is at ambassador level. HC, it's shared by the HC and the commissioner of the Disaster Risk Management Commission, which is a minister level position, and that is convey as needed be. And it's the only body or the only forum we have on strategic decisions between the government and us, and it's very restricted. It's maybe with 10, 15 people maximum, and usually it's when there's something quite serious going on that we need to have, the government inputs on how do they going to resolve that issue. But that, I've been here 2 years, and I think I've been at maybe 6 of these meetings, so it's conveying a fairly rarely basis.
Excellent, thank you. And that leads me on to the next question, which I'd like to ask you, Neil. What strategy do you have to ensure government buy-in in those humanitarian coordination bodies? How do you manage that, and what's the link in Pakistan?
Yeah, well, we don't have government participation in the HCT. We don't have government participation in the ICCG. But what we do have is a pretty regular interaction with government partners. And one way to do it is to have sort of special meetings where we have them meet with members of our team. I mean, for example, in putting together the transition framework, when we used the cluster structure initially, and we had roundtable meetings with basically all the clusters with the concerned government authority, which was called the FATA Secretariat, or the FATA Disaster Management Agency at the time. Today, for example, because there's been a change in the there's a change in the government of Pakistan, as you may know, 3 months ago, and also a change in the military leadership in the area which we're working. On our initiative, we suggested a joint meeting, essentially with the cluster group, with some members from Islamabad participating. And that way, I mean, they heard our views, we heard their views as well. I think that's the most appropriate way. I mean, the other way is that you have myself, you have the OCHA head of office, you have various agency heads, sometimes cluster heads, interacting with the government, and that way you get the input. So I'm pretty confident that we're actually, we have a good understanding of the government views, but I think in most circumstances, and especially a circumstance where you have a complex emergency, coming out of a conflict with a fair amount of political sensitivity, it's ideal if both the intercluster group and the humanitarian country team can sort of have a safe space where they can discuss both operational issues and strategic issues amongst themselves. And then if there's a need, and there quite often is, to engage with the government, do that in a separate, less structured form. Albeit you can also structure it if you wish. I mean, for example, out of today's meeting, we're trying to arrange a periodic every 2 months discussion with the same group, essentially on a sort of civil-military cooperation on humanitarian and recovery work in this area. Does that address your question, Gareth?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's very much the global norm. I think is that's done in separate channels. So thanks for sharing that. I have a question here for you, Alexandra. I suspect this comes from an ICCG or a HCT member themselves, saying sometimes we focus more on information sharing than focusing on strategic issues. How do you ensure that you have a focus on strategic decision making, and what do those strategic decisions look like?
It's so true. As I was saying before, especially when you have very big HCTs with many groups attending, and you have conflicts or crises coming up all the time. Every month we have a new crisis between the conflict and displacements and natural disasters. So it becomes very difficult to control an HCT on more strategic direction decisions. So what we are doing right now, because we're facing that challenge at this moment, and what we're doing is we're setting up, there's 2 things we're doing. One is to have an information sharing forum So we had several, this week, for example, we had several meetings with donors, groups, with NGOs, and we are thinking on what is the best approach for the future to systemize these, everybody together once a month, once every 2 weeks, different groups, etc. Because just sharing seat reps and everything is not enough. There's a lot of questions and back and forth, and sometimes we don't have all the information that is critical either. So it's good to listen to others that are have other sources. And then the other thing is, as I said earlier, we need to have a forum where we can speak among UN agencies and or humanitarian partners without so much political concerns. So we have this pre-HCT small forum that we organize now on a regular basis, because our subjects are so much more related to complex emergency now, where we have a frank discussion among us to make strategic decisions that we wouldn't be able or wouldn't be so comfortable to make in a large forum with many capitals present there. Over to you, Gareth.
Excellent, thank you. A question for you, Neil. Do you think that cluster lead agencies effectively represent clusters' point of view or their own agency's position, and how to make sure clusters are sufficiently represented?
That is a very good question. And I think it varies from situation to situation, but there is a tendency for agencies to represent themselves in such situations. But I actually think this arrangement with having some way of the intercluster group being part of the HCT is a way of providing an incentive for the cluster point of view to be represented. Because first, the agency who is responsible, who may in the best of intentions want to represent the cluster group, but they tend to revert to their agency perspective. They are reminded that they're supposed to represent the cluster by representatives of the intercluster group being there. And at the same time, and I recognize maybe it's a bit specific to Pakistan because we don't have as multiple emergencies as Alexandra's dealing with her team. But at the same time, we are able to have the voices of that intercluster group participating in the meeting. So you get that collective approach sometimes missed, but it's an issue. I mean, as I said, when I was serving as a HC in Sri Lanka, I would occasionally sit in on the intercluster groups or the sort of mini versions of those which were in the operational headquarters, so that I would get that direct view, which sometimes I did not get in the HCT, and which was important for me to make decisions as humanitarian coordinator. Over.
Thanks, Neil. And I remember from my own experience when I sat on the HCCT in Bangladesh, we had a policy where everyone had to introduce themselves as what they were representing. So for example, I was representing the NGO Forum, and I had to highlight that I was representing the forum, not my individual agency, as a way of reinforcing that as well. So thank you for that. Alexandra, do you think the HCT and the ICCG are sufficiently accountable for a functioning relationship? How are you held accountable by the wider community?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, is having action points that are tabled at the HCT and they roll from 1 week to another helps. We bring those action points back to the ICCG. I think that mechanism is, works quite well. And providing the space for the ICCG to influence the agenda of the HCT, I think it's another way to feedback the HCT. And thank you for bringing that example in Bangladesh. I'm going to use that because I have the same problem as all of you. Of sometimes we forget that we're representing a cluster. So that's a good tip.
Excellent. And do you think that the HCT and the ICCG TORs are helpful in regards to accountability? Are they widely read and understood documents?
Not really. I mean, you know, when we recently had a totally new change of leadership, and they were asking for, you know, where is the HCT TORs? Nobody could find them. And yeah, so I mean, you know, sometimes it's good to have this new leadership coming in. Everybody's new, so we realize that, you know, things that we took for granted, that we all have, you know, solid terms of reference that we knew about, suddenly it's like, oops, actually we need to revise them. They're so old that we don't even know where they are. So yeah, those things, I think you know, for us, the dynamic, the newcomers are stimulating, because they see things, they're surprised at the things that they see for the first time, and how different we are from other countries, and they push us to, you know, in different directions. We resist some, others we adopt. So it's good to have new people coming in. They ask hard questions too, and they're critical. So yeah, we welcome all the new changes that we had recently. They're really stimulating us. Over to you,
Thanks,
Darren.
Alexandra. And I think, yeah, there is lots of recognition here in the team in the room here in Geneva. Just to remind everyone, we do have those, the templates for those are available. And I know from my own experience that often they, as you say, they get forgotten and not used, and that they are useful for that accountability and to remind us all that there is a framework here, but also that it's flexible to suit our individual circumstances and the different contexts that we all work in. I have a question here for you, Neil. On the transitions to the outcomes groups, where has OCHA positioned itself? Is there dedicated space apart for humanitarian response?
Well, the way we have structured the transition framework, we have an element within it which is humanitarian, and which is the needs and such are put together by the cluster groups. And then we have another element which is you know, focused more on recovery issues. OCHA has been key in pulling together that the initial sort of humanitarian component. But in some sense, you know, what we're doing is a bit of a hybrid, because we take the OCHA, you could say, humanitarian plan as an original template, and then we have added on issues related to recovery. I mean, one thing that actually is different than earlier transition plans I was involved with is that in the earlier transition plan, we used actually a cluster architecture for the organization of it, because it seemed to fit. People were comfortable with it. In this case, partly because of the global sort of best practices on the new ways of working together, we focus rather on collective outcomes. But OCHA was quite key in supporting the preparation of this initial transition framework. And OCHA has provided the space, as they did today, for bringing partners together who otherwise are difficult to bring together. But, you know, it's, you know, I'm one person. I'm called RC8C. So I should be trying to synergize the both sides myself. And the support structure you have on the RC side is good at doing different things than the support structure you have on the OCHA side. But I actually think it's important at some point, it depends on the size of the operation, to have a closer degree of integration between the RC office and the OCHA office, so that you get these sort of holistic views, recognizing that in some cases for a big issue, you have to have a primarily humanitarian response. And of course, if there's a new thing developing, that's it. But in many cases, and in so many cases around the world where you have protracted emergencies, you have to have elements of both. And you have to have a system that provides you to have those elements rather than dividing it up. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also links to many of the discussions that we hear on the Nexus around the need to balance how do we balance the need for separate humanitarian space while also realizing the potential to realize complementarities between our longer term development goals as well. So thank you both. We're almost out of time now, so I'll just take one more question, and particularly maybe to ask you, Alexandra, is it useful for the ICCG coordinator to be part of the HCT meetings? I think we know the answer to that, but if you could tell us why you think that's so critical, that'd be very helpful.
Well, I'll be very honest with you. You know, in Ethiopia, it's a huge country. We have 106 million people. It's 8 million people in the humanitarian appeal. There's a huge development program. So you can't ask the heads of agencies to be so much on top of the information that they need in order to make the right decisions. They do their best. They're all very busy, but it's very good to have the cluster coordinators next to them to help provide them with specific guidance, information. They're very well informed. They've all extremely hardworking, and they focus a lot more on the operations, of course. So I think it's very helpful to have them there. And as we are, now streaming, for example, our HCT, one of the initial suggestions was, okay, only heads of agencies leading, will attend the HCT, will reduce the number of people. And immediately many heads of agencies said, I need my cluster coordinators with me. So I agree very much. I think it's very helpful to have them around the table and be able to call in that expertise when needed be.
Excellent, thank you. So we're sadly out of time, but thank you both to Neil and Alexandra for their contributions. A few key points I'll just very quickly pull out. Firstly, contextual solutions are critical. Both the countries we're talking about are large, complex emergencies, so that's really critical. Another key theme for me was around the importance of staying strategic and ensuring that two-way understanding. And the challenge I think we all faced about just resisting the urge to share information. I think a third key point for me was the importance of having that diverse input, and that really into both the ICCG and the HCT, and that includes kind of from experts, Alexandra mentioned that to us, local NGOs, as Neil highlighted, donors, government and other actors. I think the importance of the engagement with government probably outside of HCT and the ICCG, but making sure there's that two-way conversation is critical. And ensuring, I really liked your point, Neil, about the importance of leadership engagement in the ICCG directly. Not necessarily all the time, but just to get that insight and that understanding is really, really critical. And then we also picked up on the point about ICCG engagement in a HCT can really incentivize better representation of cluster perspectives of those wider groups. Also picked up on the point of how important it is to share and use TORs, and Venkatesh has included the link, I think, to those documents in the chat box, so you can find those there directly. And then the final point was many of these challenges are linking in with discussions that we're already having in many country contexts at the moment around how we use the nexus to link those things together. So a lot of these issues are being discussed, but it's also best practices already happening on the ground in the field. So on that note, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you very much, both again to Neil and Alexandra, and to everyone for joining. I think we had a really good, diverse attendance. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great moderation, Gareth.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll close there.
Okay, bye-bye. Yeah? Oh. No, actually, it's useful for conference calls, right? I'll put it here in my drawer. In case you need it for some reason, you can take it over here.